everybody was not equal. So one of the great Masoretic scholars, who was Christian David Ginsburg, he was British, I believe, and he was a Christian, but he was Jewish. He explains this change that the Masoretes made because they felt that to say that the Lord was standing for Abraham was really inappropriate, because you've got the superior in the position of the inferior. It should be Abraham who was standing before the Lord, rather than the Lord was standing before Abraham. Do you get me? Okay. So they made a change. And when I checked NIV, it has taken into account, let's see, Abraham remains standing before the Lord. It has taken into account, again, was taken into account the change, not the original reading, which, you see what the translator is doing. He's using his own view of the text to make these decisions. Am I coming through? Actually, I think this is a little bit divergent from what we're doing, but it's fine for you to know some of these interesting details about how our Bible came to be. And the way the Old Testament came to be is very different from the way the New Testament came to be. The Old Testament came into being through the efforts of the prophets and the psalmists and so forth. And there was that group of Jews who really protected it and made it their lot in life to preserve it and do it as accurately as they could. And as they did that, they made some changes. Now, I hope that doesn't destroy your view of inerrancy. There are a lot of textual changes that you'll find in these English translations. One of the things that really bugs me when I read ESV, the Psalms, is their rendering of the verb to give thanks. I think I mentioned that in one of the lessons. It's a rather technical term. To give thanks is not exactly to praise, and that's the way that. No, I'm sorry. It's the NIV that does that. To give thanks is not. It has overlap with to praise, but it's not exactly to praise. It means something quite different. And when you translate the verb to give thanks, and you translate it to praise, it covers over some of the nuances that the psalmist want us to hear, and that is, you give thanks because of something God has done for you. And you even will make a pledge. You'll hear the psalmist saying, I've vowed to give thanks. Well, what they're saying is, I vow to give thanks. I'm going to call my friends and my family to a service in the temple or the tabernacle, whichever is appropriate. And we're going to have a service of thanks, and we're going to celebrate what God has done for me. And when you translate the verb to give thanks as praise, you sort of cover over that distinctive meaning of the verb. Well, that's one of my gripes. Well, before I go on, I'll let you ask any questions if you have them.
In many Bibles, if you read the foreword, they kind of tell you why they translated things the way they did.
That's what, very good. Thanks for mentioning that. In both of these instances, NIV has a footnote. And we should learn to read the footnotes because they're very important. In both instances, they tell us that the Masoretes read it a certain way. And in the case of Genesis 18:22, they give us a footnote that they're rendering it differently from the original text. Yes.
You're using the word, I'm hearing it as Masoretes. Masoretes, okay,
The Masoretes.
yes, okay, so I guess my question is, so this is a people group from way long ago?
Yeah, they were a group of Jewish scholars who lived in Tiberias, on the Sea of Galilee. And they spent their whole life just studying the text. And there's the work they did is called the Masorah. So if you were reading a Hebrew text, especially the newest edition of the Hebrew text by American Bible Society or the German Bible Society, you would find notes at the bottom of the page that refer you to the Masorah. And when you come across a text like Habakkuk 1:12, you'll find a note in the Masorah. That's where you find it. So it's a technical group of remembrances that the Masoretes made, but we still have them. They're there, and but the New Testament came into being in a very different way. I don't have time to talk about that, and I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I do know a little bit about the New Testament and how it came into being. Okay, other questions? Yes, please.
So when you define giving thanks as being what God has done for you, would you define praise as the obvious attributes of God, or?
Well, it's entirely a voluntary thing in the Psalms. When the psalmist says, I will give thanks to you, and in the same psalm he may say, I vow to give thanks to you. And particularly when you hear those words, I vow to give thanks to you, you know what he has in mind. He's going to call a special Thanksgiving service. We have it in the book of Leviticus. And on that service, he's going to meet his family and friends in the temple, and they're going to celebrate what God has done. And it's a specific victory that he has experienced in his life. When we come to Psalm 107, which we're going to do, there are 4 scenarios in Psalm 107 where the psalmist outlines something that God does. There it's more a generic kind of thing rather than a specific personal experience that the psalmist has had. But the service of Thanksgiving was a completely voluntary service, and they came together to celebrate that specific thing that God had done. Maybe he had been ill and he's recovered. Maybe he was on a ship and thought he was going to perish, and he was saved. So they meet to give thanks to God for what he had done. And they make a sacrifice, and the sacrifice on that occasion is partially eaten by the congregation. That shows you how celebratory it is. Normally the congregation didn't eat anything from the sacrificial animal, but on this occasion they do. Did I speak to your question?
So you would define praise as how would you differentiate praise?
Well, when we praise God, we generally are doing it in a general sense. We're thanking Him, we're praising Him for who He is, for what He's done, yes. But the word to give thanks in the Psalms, not always, but very often, and I would say perhaps more often than not, carries the idea that the psalmist has in mind a specific occasion when God has done something great for him. And he is going to call together this family and friend event at the temple, and they're going to have a special service of Thanksgiving. I really think this is a beautiful tradition. In my pastorate at Warren Park, we had a period of time when there were so many people in the congregation that had experienced some very serious physical issues, and various things had gone on. And I thought, well, now we need to have a special service of Thanksgiving. So one Sunday morning, I just designed a service of Thanksgiving for us to come together, and during the service, we gave opportunities personally for those people to give thanks to God for what He had done for them. We didn't have a sacrifice, but that was all right. Okay. Now let's go to Psalm 4. Lesson 4, Psalm 22. This is one of the most marvelous and perplexing psalms in the Psalter. Now, I've given you two pictures here, a picture of the annuals and the perennials, because this psalm represents a mixture of the types of psalm. One part of the psalm is a lament. That's the first part of the psalm. And the second part of the psalm is a psalm of praise. Now, I want you to understand that these 9 types that I've given you in these lessons are not types the psalmists were working with. They knew what they were doing when they were giving praise, and they knew what they were doing when they were lamenting. And of course, they knew what they were doing when they were cursing. Psalms 35 and 69 and 109. They certainly knew that there were categories of expression that were appropriate for that particular psalm, but they weren't working with our categories. These categories that I gave you are categories that have been articulated and categorized in modern scholarship. But when they sat down to write a psalm, David was not saying, "No, I'm going to write a lament." He had in mind that he was going to say some lamented things, but he felt quite free to write, make the psalm a psalm of praise as well, and that's what we have in Psalm 22. We have a psalm that is a lament and praise. So I just want you to understand that we're not talking about categories that the psalmists themselves talked about. Maybe they did talk about them, we don't know. But they certainly did not divide the psalms into those strict categories like we attempt to do in modern scholarship. Now, the first principle we want to look at, of course, is principle number 3, literary and theological categories. I think my metaphor here is a good one. When we take the time to try to put a psalm into a category, one of these categories I've given you, I think it does help us to guide our study. And I've called it a rudder. it's a small thing, but it certainly does help. Psalm 22 defies our compartmentalization efforts because we have two types of psalms here. We have the lament and praise. And the interesting thing is that there is in the text a hinge where the psalmist turns from lament to praise, and that's in verses 19 through 21. Now, interpretive principle number 4, God's names, and this psalm is a very interesting one, and I think a good illustration of the whole idea I'm trying to transfer to you about the use of God's name. I'm not saying that my principle that I've tried to articulate can be effective every time you apply it, but there are so many instances when we find the use of God's name to be very revealing about who the psalmist is, what the psalmist is trying to do and accomplish, and how he is approaching that. So we know that God has many names in the Old Testament. He has a generic name, God, Elohim, and we found in Psalm 19 that there the psalmist uses the shortened form of Elohim. He uses El. Do you remember Jesus' word on the cross? We're going to talk about that. He says, Eli, Eli, in one instance. In other instances, it's different. It's Aramaic. El just is the shortened form of Elohim. It means God. Elohim means God. El is the shortened form. It means God. But God has a personal name. And he told Moses, Moses said, when I go to Israel and I tell them what to do, who shall I tell them send me? And the Lord said, tell them I am sent you. And then he reveals his name to Moses, Adonai. So the troubling question that opens up the psalm uses the shortened form of the generic name. It uses the name El. Eli, Eli. You remember at the cross, some of them thought he was calling Elijah. Eli. Elijah's Eliyahu. And El would be a shortened form of the name Elijah. So in part 1, the one occurrence of the personal name Lord is on the lips of mockers. So if you're going to mock Israel's God, you're probably not going to use the term El or Elohim. That's too generic. That could be any God. But you're going to use his specific personal name, and that's precisely what the mockers do. Now, this is the text, and I just wanted you to see how these names are distributed in the text. We begin with my God, my God. It occurs in verse 1. It occurs in verse 2. And it occurs in verse 10, verse 10. And the one time that the personal name occurs is on the lips of mockers. Am I coming through? You understand why they would use the name Lord if they're mocking Israel's God? They're going to use his personal name. Now, look what happens when we come to verse 19. And the psalmist begins to make a transition from his lament to his words of praise. he uses the covenant name, Lord. And we have it in 19:23. I think that's 25 or 26, 27, 28, 30. So you see what happens here. We have the very same thing in Psalm 19. Do you remember how the psalm begins? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day into day utter his speech, night into night showeth knowledge. There is no language nor speech where his voice is not heard. His line is gone out through all the earth, and his words to the end of the world. And then we set a tabernacle with the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoices as a strong man to run a race. Then when he comes to the second part of the psalm, what does he do? He turns to using the covenant name, God's personal name, Lord. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. Because the law is God's expression of himself, and the psalmist knows this very well. And when he talks about the law of God, he's more likely to talk in terms of the law of the Lord than the law of God. The psalm becomes very personal for him at that point. He's expressing his faith in the law of God when he comes to that part of the psalm where he's extolling the God who reveals himself in the law, and he calls him Lord. Now, questions about this observation? Well, I realize that I suppose the frustration that some of you may have, and some of you probably ought to have, is when are we going to start listening to the Psalms? Well, we're already listening to the Psalms. We're just trying to listen more deeply than we are accustomed to do. I said early in the course, we tend to read the Psalms flatly. We tend to read them as they're two-dimensional, but the Psalms are three-dimensional. And what we're trying to do is understand that there is a depth here that can be fathomed to a great extent. And sometimes we get down beneath the surface and we don't even know how we got there. What I'm trying to do is tell us how to get there. So when we get there, we know how we got there. Now, interpretive principle number 3, key themes. Sometimes the key themes are not easy to identify. Here they are. What is the opening key theme?
That God seems to be far off.
That's right. That God is far off. In fact, he is so far off, the psalmist believes he has forsaken him. So when we see the key themes, one thing we should do is look at the whole psalm and see if we can find other ways that the psalmist has expressed or reinforced that key theme. And Psalm 22 is just an excellent example of how the psalmist does this. So in this case, the vacuous nature of God's abandonment of the psalmist is the opening key theme. And this is the way he reinforces it. he wants us to get a feeling for the psalmist's forsakenness. He wants us to feel it. So David shows what a keen and expert literary figure he was in this psalm. So David uses little phrases to reinforce the vacuous nature of the psalm's emotional state. When David calls, there is no answer. Verse 2. When trouble comes, there is none to help. Verse 11. When his physical strength is spent and he is thirsty, there is no water and he has no strength. So what he's doing here is he is pulling out the life circumstances which he has experienced and using those life circumstances to underwrite this complaint that opens the psalm. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? No, he does even more than that. He goes a little farther and expresses the vacuous nature of his life in the presence of God, absent the presence of God, by saying, verse 1, why are you so far from saving me? Verse 11, do not be far from me. Verse 19, be not far off. So, you see what he's doing? He's introduced this theme in verse 1, and he is reinforcing it in various ways in the psalm. He wants us to get a feeling for what he has experienced. So, I think that is a literary device which John Milton would appreciate. It's quite a literary feature of this psalm. Okay, and questions about this? Yes,
Not a question, but a comment. As I was reading this week, those short phrases, I got very emotional about going through this because reading it from a messianic perspective, I could feel that it was almost like gasping for air and just desperation and to think about Christ on the cross and relating it to that. It was very emotional.
Yes, what she's saying is when she was reading the psalm, she became very emotional to read these ways that David has reinforced that theme. And then, of course, for us Christians, we can't help but think of Jesus' use of these words on the cross, and we're going to talk about that.
And then it seems that at the end, at the end of the lament, they become longer. The phrases seem to become a little longer.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and interestingly, that is a literary technique that we find in the Psalms. We find it especially in the Psalms of Ascents, 120 to 134, where the psalmist will give us a short phrase. Then the next line or two, he'll give us the same short phrase plus an additional word or two or phrase. It's a one thing I want you to come through this course recognizing is that the Psalms, not all of them, they're different. They're all kinds of literary specimens in the Psalter. But I want you to realize how beautiful some of them are. how well done. And the psalmist here wants us to experience this God-forsakenness with him. And he keeps reinforcing it. It's just beautiful. So, in addition to the opening theme that God had abandoned, and David reveals other aspects of his life that exacerbate the emptiness or that substantiate his cry. One of them is 22:6. I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. He had a low view of himself. Verse 7, all who see me mock me, they make mouths at me, they wag their heads. That's not a very nice experience to have. And his enemies attack him like charging bulls and vicious dogs. They even engage in sarcastic mockery of his God. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. So, our psalmist has done a terrific job reinforcing that theme. Now, our next principle, number 6. How many voices are there in the psalm? We could ask the question another way. We could ask, how many listeners does the psalmist have? Who are listening? And we can talk about that. They don't speak, but we know they're listening. And when we try to apply this principle, we want to look at the subjects of the verbs. Look at the proper nouns. It is not very often that David is mentioned in the Psalms, except in the titles. Occasionally he is, but not very often. I think he is mentioned in 132. Check me on that. I read that last night, and I think he's mentioned my name there. The proper nouns and the pronouns. So, how many voices? The first person singular pronouns, I, me, my, dominate in 22, 1 through 2, 6 through 8, and 26, I think that should be 31. So it's an error. So we find him using the first singular pronouns, I, and of course the I is who? It's David, the psalmist. The second person pronoun in verses 3 through 5 and so forth is, of course, God. He's talking to God. And he starts off talking to God, my God, calling up for thou hast thou forsaken me. And then, interestingly, he finishes the song by using the third person pronouns. He, they, and we'll take a look. So, look at this. The red are the words of the psalmist. There is only one time in this psalm that we hear another voice, and it's in verse 8. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Of course, that rings a bell too when we think about Calvary. And then the green represents the address to to the third persons, and they, of course, are his compatriots, those who would worship with him, and so forth. Now, when we see this, we see the wide range of the psalm. It ranges all the way from the psalmist's personal abandonment by God, or at least his feeling that he has been abandoned by God, verse 1, to the third person, verse 27, the greater kingdom of God that includes all the families of the nations. So he's talked in terms of his own feelings, I, me, and he has talked to God directly, you, and he has talked about his compatriots, they. Now, this principle here is one that applies in a number of different situations. We need to watch for the literary devices such as metaphors, questions, repetitions, vows, and oaths, and so forth. And here, one question that we have in the Psalms that we often just sort of glide over as we read them is why. My professor said, anytime you hear the question why in the Psalms, it's fraught with deep sorrow and deep feelings. Why? And he said, when you hear the psalmist say how long, he is thinking how painfully long must we wait? And we hear this question quite often in the Psalms. Now, maybe this is what most of us are waiting for, how the psalm is used in the New Testament. New Testament quotations, allusions, and messianic images. If I asked you what psalm is most often quoted in the New Testament, what would be your guess?
23.
You can guess what? Which one?
23.
23? It's hardly mentioned at all,
Really?
interestingly.
110.
Which one?
110.
120?
110.
Oh, 110. Well, that is mentioned. It's basically in the Epistle to the Hebrews. In terms of a little more widespread use of the Psalms, Psalm 69 is the most quoted of all the Psalms. And Psalm 69 is one of the cursing Psalms. But it's the most widely quoted psalm in the Psalter. I haven't done a check on this statement, but I think that Psalm 22 would probably be the second most quoted psalm in the New Testament. Of course, we know, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And I think it's in all of these instances, I think it's quoted in Aramaic. Now, even the verb is different. Forsaken is a different verb. It's the Aramaic verb. Any ideas why Jesus might have used the Aramaic? He was dying on the cross.
Probably for the same reason the New Testament's written in Greek, is because that was the market language, the everyday language.
That's right. It was his language. And I wonder too, I'm sure Jesus knew the Hebrew. I wonder too if perhaps Jesus tended to use the Aramaic because this was a dying moment. Maybe you've known those people whose native language is not English, and they come down to those the last days of their lives, and oftentimes they'll switch to their native language. We have a dear friend in Irvine, our daughter-in-law's mother, in fact, who's dealing with dementia, and her native language is German. Now she speaks mostly German. That's the easy way to do it. And I just wonder to what extent it might have been that Jesus dying on the cross, he uses the Aramaic because it was his native language, and he just automatically uses that language to say these things. Now, in the other instances, I don't believe there are any other instances of the 7 last words that are in Aramaic. Now, we have some other Aramaisms in the New Testament. Father, you remember? Abba, that's Aramaic. Maranatha? Right. Now, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It occurs in 3 of the Gospels, not in John, which is interesting. Well, John's a very different gospel. Oh, I love it. But it's just a very different gospel. He has other objectives. And he does tell the story of the passion and the crucifixion beautifully. I heard a hymn the other day, and I've forgotten what it was. It might have been at the Ash Wednesday service we attended on Wednesday night. But it was the hymn was to the effect that he laid down his life, and John makes an emphasis of this, that Jesus' life wasn't taken, he gave. And I think you'll find when John describes his death, he says he bowed his head. He is the subject. He bowed his head and died. Now, the dividing of Christ's garments and the casting lots for them is also found in the Gospels. In fact, all of the Gospels. I think that is particularly interesting. The hurling of insults at Jesus is found in Matthew and Mark. Now, these are from Psalm 22. The psalmist's trust in God is mentioned by Matthew 27. The letter to the Hebrews asserts that Christ is not ashamed to call his followers brothers, which leads the writer to affirm that Christ and his followers are members of the same family. And that seems to be a reflection of 22:22. So the use of the question of 22:1 by Matthew and Mark raises this question. How were Christ's abandonment by the Father and the psalmist different? Particularly since the psalmist confesses that the Lord had not hidden his face from him. I wish I had time to talk about how the New Testament writers used Scripture I'll just very briefly, I'll make this statement and say no more today. But there is a theory, and I think a very plausible theory, that when the New Testament writers, like Paul, quoted a New Testament text, they had in mind not just that verse, but the larger text of the verse. Now think, when Jesus uses this statement on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And there's so much of the psalm that is praise and God's deliverance and the kingdom of God that awaits us in the future. You wonder if, at least subconsciously, Jesus had all of that in mind. It wasn't just God's abandonment. That was painful and it was mysterious. But what about including those praises that the psalm gives us? This theory has a label. It's called metalepsis. 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 And it means that when the New Testament writers quote a New Testament text, they have in mind the larger text, not just that verse. So we don't have time to talk about that more, but nevertheless, it makes me wonder if Jesus didn't have in mind more than God's abandonment of him. He knew that he was there for God to abandon him, yes, to experience that, but he knew he was there for a great victory too. Now, I want to do something else to end the class. This quotation from Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper was a great theologian. He was the Prime Minister of Amsterdam, and he has a little book on the Psalms, which is really, really neat. And he makes this statement: God's saints on earth have such a mystical communication with their Father who is in heaven. And as little as primitive man can understand our telegraphic communication, so little can the man of the world understand the mysterious communion of the believer with the Father, who is far off and yet close by. And for this very reason, it is true that this communion can be interrupted and sometimes entirely broken off. There are moments when the soul cries after God, seeks him, the heart goes out to him, and nothing comes back. No sign from above is vouchsafed. It seems that God is away, nothing but silence remains, and no voice comes. There is no answer. Why at such times God withdraws himself from this child can be surmised, but never can be fathomed. The cry of Jesus, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, remains an impenetrable mystery. Now, what I want to do is I want us to end the class by reading the poem I gave you in the notes. Maybe it'd be better if you just turn there. Once I find it. It's Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem on Cooper's grave. Cooper was one of the major poets of the 18th century in England. He was a friend of John Newton's, and Newton was very influential in his life. he had a bout with depression. He was even put into an insane asylum at one point. But he wrote some of the most profound poetry, and on Cooper's grave deals with this very idea that we're talking about. Deserted. God could separate from his own essence, rather. And Adam's sins have swept between the righteous Son and Father. Yea, once Emmanuel's orphan cry, his universe hath shaken. It went up single, echoless. My God, I am forsaken. It went up from the holy lips amid his lost creation that of the lost, no son should use those words of desolation. That earth's worst frenzies, marring hope, should mar not hope's fruition. And I, this is Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I on Cooper's grave shall see his rapture in the vision. The interesting way Elizabeth Barrett Browning interprets this phrase from Psalm 22, verse 1, is to say that Jesus' cry from the cross was echoless, so that you and I would never experience that kind of forsakenness. What do you think about that? It's her interpretation, but I personally like to think that the assessment merits. There is an interpretive method of Scripture, interpreting the New Testament Scriptures, especially the Old Testament prophecies, that we call the fuller sense. That is, applying it to 22:1, the psalmist there was experiencing God's abandonment, but not in the fullest sense of the word. Only Jesus would and could have that experience. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning says he had it, and the idea was that he was echoless. There was no bouncing back, no answer. And it was so that we never had to ask that question, knowing that we had been absolutely abandoned. So Jesus fulfills this prophecy in the fuller sense of the word. Okay, I'll entertain a question or two here at the end. We're our time's about gone.
Do you think in the Psalms that sometimes, especially David being prophetic, that he didn't realize he was writing prophecy?
Oh, I think so. Yes, and I think there were sometimes he did realize he was writing about a future event, a future person would come and fulfill his fulfill the aspirations that he was expressing. You remember what Peter says that, let's see.
Yeah.
You remember that
Yeah.
passage from 1 Peter 1, that the prophets prophesied, and they didn't seem to recognize quite as candidly as we, that they were prophesying for us. And so I think that I think this is wonderful. It's wonderful to think what a great privilege we have to live on this side of the cross, the resurrection. Okay, well, thank you. You're a very attentive audience, and I appreciate it. And I've enjoyed doing this song. Next Sunday we're going to do Psalm 30, right? Is it 30?
107.
107, okay. I'll get it straight before then. 107, oh, it is a beautiful song. Okay, thank you.